anyone who hasn't really gone through this crazy life transition, it might be hard to relate to. I've met people who have gone through something horrible, like say, and they say like it was the best thing that happened to me. And to me, sometimes that feels like a coping mechanism, not to discredit whatever they feel, but it's like it sucks to have to go through something hard. I never want to take that away from myself, to give myself the agency to grieve, but then also simultaneously to be proud of what I created. I have been able to take the lemons and turn it into some pretty good lemonade, but it will never take away from the fact that there's not a day that goes by in my life where I don't wish that I could turn back time.
Welcome back to Care So Much. I am so excited for my guest today. Her name is Karina Ho. She is an artist, and her artist moniker is
Onikho.
Onikho. Okay.
That's Onikho.
Perfect. We're just going to keep this whole thing in so that people can hear you say it correctly and the spelling. She is a music producer and electronic artist. And today we are fittingly talking about one of many people's favorite things, which is music. There's so many things within that about why we care so much about it and why Onikho cares about it specifically. So we will be talking about all of that today. But without further ado, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you care so much about music?
First of all, thanks for inviting me. I'm an electronic artist. That's not how I came up through the world of music. This is a podcast, so you can't see that I'm Asian. But I stereotypically grew up playing classical piano and violin, and doing ballet. So doing all the things that in typical Chinese immigrant mother thought would make me a well-rounded child. So that was my introduction to the arts. However, also growing up in a very pragmatic immigrant household, the arts was always kind of an inaccessible pathway as a career path. It was always supposed to be a hobby and nothing more. I was supposed to be a doctor, a lawyer, or go into business, because those are the only three things that a person can do in this life. So that's kind of where the arts lived in my life as a young adult. I still very much wanted and dreamt about doing it full time, but never really dared to. So I played in bands throughout my young adulthood, danced with independent choreographers, but that was pretty much the extent of it. Then in 2014, I was in a car accident and I sustained a spinal cord injury. So I am now paralyzed from the chest down. I'm a full-time wheelchair user, and it was just a shock to my world. Also, in that accident, I lost my mom, who was sort of that link to keeping the arts as a hobby. And so in reeling from that catastrophe, the arts evolved into a new role in my life. And especially as I was recovering from, a major like a spinal surgery, and just trying to transition into being a human who used a wheelchair and lived with paralysis, from going from a healthy, active, quote unquote, normal, able-bodied person. Yeah, it was really heavy, as you can imagine. It was a really, really dark time. I was also grieving the loss of my mother. And so music sort of came back into my life as a coping mechanism. It started I remember when my family moved my electric piano into the new apartment that I had to move into, because the old one I lived in had steps. And I would just roll up to it with my, gigantic neck brace, because I could barely move, and just started to kind of play some really simple chords and sing over it. I could barely sing at the time because my diaphragm was shot. And from that was sort of the origin of what my music project Onikho is today. So it started from that place of darkness, and then over time grew. And like I said, I played in bands. So I was, often be the keyboardist, the vocalist. I would schlep my gear across town to go to gigs, play in random bars. But as a disabled person, I could no longer do that. So I started learning how to produce music on the computer. And I would always I used to poo-poo that as a classically trained musician. I was like, people who make music come to computers, they're not actual musicians. And I was so wrong as I started to go into this deep rabbit hole of what music production is, which is kind of like a modern day composer is the way I like to think about it. You use the
Mm.
software in order to put together the various parts of a piece of music. So that's the rhythm section, that's the various layers, that's the tone, the color, whatever soundscape behind it, all that kind of stuff. And I started to go deeper into that world. That opened up the music that I was able to make as an independent artist. And so now I would define my music as primarily electronic. I said brooding electronic, as I tap into a place of melancholy very often. But I sing over it, and it's, I guess it melds my influences of classical music, my love of the blues, of jazz, of pop music. So it's, yeah, I would say it's pretty accessible to your average listener, and I'm proud of it.
I sort of want to start by backing up a little bit and looking at a bit of that role that you talked about when music was just that hobby, and both as somebody, as an artist playing music, and then also as a human in the world consuming music. What kind of, prior to that accident that you had in 2014, what sort of role did music play before? And
I wasn't one of those kids who was obsessed with my instrument. Unfortunately, I didn't have the discipline. It was, it was a chore. My mom had to make me practice. And I did get a lot of joy when I was able to nail pieces. I loved playing really fast, complex classical pieces by, Chopin, by Rachmaninoff. And when I was able to really become familiar with the piece and just execute it with such ease, that gave me such a thrill. So I always knew that I loved music, and the technical execution of it, the beauty of hearing yourself create something sonically, beautiful and unique. But it definitely took prodding from my mom. And then growing up, I began to wander into the world of blues and jazz, just wanting some more free form, independent expression. And that's when music began to be more of a vehicle of self-expression than it was before.
I've never heard it described like that. And I'm somebody who enjoys music very casually. I have enjoyed jazz, but I've always felt like jazz and blues and those sorts of genres of music have been ones that I can tell as I'm listening to it that there's layers to this that I'm not understanding. Like I just don't have. So I'm very curious as to what about, beyond sort of at the obvious level, as to why those genres of music allow for more self-expression, but also what about your experience of learning more about those became something that you then were experiencing this music in this new way, where it wasn't something about perfecting, it was about exploring?
Well, classical music is very structured. For anyone who doesn't really know that much about music, oftentimes classical musicians are trained to read a piece of music, interpret it, and then execute it to a high degree of technical perfection. It's not so much a form of music that allows for improvisation, of allowing the musician to fill in the blanks with their own interpretation, which is where jazz and blues, which is a lot more freeform, it's often based on very simple song structures, very simple, like a jazz chart will basically be the melody written out and then just what chords. And then the rest, the musician fills in. And that's why every jazz, and not every, but most times a piece of jazz or blues music will be different depending on who's playing it, when they're playing it, every time they play it. And it's because they're just filling it in depending on what they feel that day. And I felt like that was such a cool, radical breakaway from my classical upbringing. And yeah, it is layered because it's the own a person exists within those spaces. And not saying that classical music isn't layered and complex, it's just in a different way.
That's what I think is interesting about the way you described it, is that wouldn't be the first way I describe jazz music, right? As like this free expression, and that's the distinction. But I think it's so interesting to hear you talk about these two genres and how your experience of that sort of evolved. So I know from what you've talked about, this accident and becoming paralyzed and going through this period of grief for both losing your mother and, I'm assuming, some of the additional layers of that,
Many layers.
is a real turning point for you in music. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about both the like actual experience of that and the I'm sure it's a story you've been in a position to tell many times, and then also what role music played in that, like what that was for you in that time.
Yeah, I mean, the days in the hospital, it's hard to describe just how end of the world it felt. When we go through life, a lot of us grow up in, if we're privileged enough to do it, to grow up in a sense of a safety bubble, like nothing can hurt us, especially when you're young. I mean, that's kind of what youth is. You just feel like you're untouchable. And I was 26 at the time. So young, in the throes of just being carefree and just thinking about myself and what I wanted to do with my life, and to go from that and then literally not being able to turn yourself in your bed was, it was devastating. Especially, I grew up dancing, and the freedom of being in my body and knowing that my body could do all these things and was flexible and strong and agile, and then to not even be able to use the bathroom independently. That's, that's some heartbreak. That's some extreme grief that took years to process. So especially in the early days, I didn't really know, like there were no words to express what I was feeling. And the people around me, as well-intentioned and caring as they were, no one could really understand. And that was before I had any sort of contact with a disability community, which since then I found out has been so valuable, because knowing other people who have known that depth of grief and loss in their life is really, really important to my own healing process. But back then I was super isolated. And so, yeah, the first song that I ever wrote for this project, it's called Brave One. And it's kind of about like the chorus is, the lyrics are like, the world fall down on me. And it was a pretty literal reflection of how I felt. I just felt like everything was horrible. Like every tragedy was falling down on my shoulders at once.
Fall down on me. Let the world 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 fall down on me.
That's where it started.
What you're describing is, I want to be really careful about the way I talk about it, because I think, and I imagine this is something you experience, that there's this temptation when you've done what you have done, which is have this really tragic, really sort of difficult experience and created something beautiful and wonderful on the far side of that, to then romanticize the moment of pain. I don't want to do that. I don't think one thing diminishes the other.
I agree. I'm glad you bring it up. It's kind of a hard thing to put your finger on. And I imagine for anyone who hasn't really gone through this sort of like crazy life transition, it might be hard to relate to. But yeah, I've met people who have gone through something horrible, like say they, lost a limb or, whatever. And they say it, and then they come out and they start doing charity work and start their own foundation and do all these amazing things. And they say like, it was the best thing that happened to me. And to me, sometimes that feels like a coping mechanism, not to discredit whatever they feel, but like, it just sucks. Like it sucks to have to go through something hard and lose things. And I never want to take that away from myself, to give myself the agency to grieve and be angry at the circumstances of my life,
Yeah.
But then also simultaneously to be proud of what I created. I mean, I'm not anywhere near where I want to be as an artist yet. I'm still very much on this journey, but, I just came back from touring in Europe, and I'm still, I'm getting really interesting opportunities to collaborate with artists. And so I have been able to take this, I have been able to take the lemons and turn it into some pretty good lemonade. But it will never
Yeah.
take away from the fact that there's not a day that goes by in my life where I don't wish that I could turn back time.
I just think of ways, this isn't me trying to, these are not the same thing. The thing I'm going to reference and the thing that you've gone through is not the same, but I just.
Oh, please. I think everyone has space in their own lives to.
All I was going to say is I think I've often had people tell me that I'm like so strong or so resilient or like all of these things because of issues that I've had in my past. It's a hard balancing act, like you're describing, of I am strong and I am resilient and I want to celebrate those things about me, but I also would rather have not had to be those things. Like I also would rather have gotten the things in my life that I have and grown in different ways, not because I went through something really difficult. And I think that's just, it seems like that's what you're also expressing, of like balancing that you can be incredibly grateful and have beautiful and wonderful things in your life because of this terrible thing that happened. And that doesn't make the terrible thing not terrible. And it doesn't make the beautiful things not beautiful.
Yeah, I think that's something that our society falls short in. We're so afraid to acknowledge adversity. We're so afraid to acknowledge tragedy and loss and death, especially, that we try to gleam over things with like, by only looking at the positive. And it cheats people of, growing from those hard places. And I think that's where, so there's a term called inspiration porn, and it primarily pertains to people with disabilities. Like if you're in a wheelchair, and this has happened to me, if I'm like just wheeling outside, minding my own business, going to my grocery store, people will be like, oh, you're such an inspiration. And, to me, it sounds ludicrous because I'm just out and about doing my thing. But to them, like I have overcome mountains to like leave my house that day and just overcome all the sad, tragic aspects of my life as a poor disabled person. And it doesn't come from malintent, but it does come from our like societal fear of facing, the crap things about life.
I wanted to acknowledge that before I asked you kind of how after that moment and being in that place, I'm sure it was a process, and I'm sure in some ways, what were some of the things that moved you forward in that? And you mentioned that disability community and having that group, and I know that music played a big role in that story as well.
Yeah, well, I'm going to diverge to another part of the arts. So shortly after, I think I had mentioned I grew up doing ballet, really enjoyed doing dance, contemporary dance, all that stuff. And then after I was injured, I just remember a very dramatic point where I was throwing my ballet shoes away and my leotards away, just thinking I would never dance again, because at that point I did not know anything about what was possible post-injury in my mind, because I was, subscribed to that ableist view of disability where, we all just sit in front of our television screens and drool for the rest of our lives. It was so depressing. I just felt like my life was over. Obviously that's not true. So a good friend of mine who is in the dance community reached out to me and was like, hey, do you know about this dance company? They're based in downtown Oakland. I live in the Bay Area in California. He was like, I can connect you to the artistic director. They're called Axis Dance Company. And I was like, I kind of heard about that, sort of ish. And he's like, yeah, they're a professional dance company, and they cast dancers both with and without disabilities. Like that's their whole thing. It's integrating all bodies to kind of create a more inclusive space in the arts, because dance is a notoriously ableist and exclusive space. And I was kind of like, okay, like, sure. And so I went in and I met the artistic director. Her name is Judy Smith. And I took a class, and I was just totally not sold at first, because I was like, dancing in my, like, all I'm doing is waving my arms around. I'm sitting in my wheelchair. I'm looking in the mirror and I look terrible. Like, this sucks. But Judy reached out to me and she was like, hey, like, I actually got some money to bring on an apprentice, and I thought that you could be great. I know you're very much early on in your kind of recovery journey, but why don't you give it a go? And so I did. Um, and to be honest, for a long time, I was not sold. I hated how it felt in my body. I hated the fact that I couldn't
Mm.
twirl and do all the cool tricks that I used to be able to do, whereas other dancers could, the dancers who were not disabled. But even the dancers who were disabled were super athletic, super strong, like could do crazy things, and I couldn't do a single thing. But over time, I started to work with this company and become stronger myself, and really just see
Mm.
that, see all the creative opportunities that were created by just putting different bodies in a space. Um, and it really opened up my eyes to the fact that inclusion, like there was so much creative opportunity in the world of inclusion. And
Mm-hmm.
and it's something as a kind of traditional dancer I'd never thought of before because I didn't have to. But all of a sudden I was in this body that most people would have wrote off and been like, you don't belong on stage. But this company was sort of defying that. And they're not the only company that does it in the world. There
Mm-hmm.
are others. But it was such a revolutionary idea. And so eventually I became a full-time company member, and I ended up touring the United States and teaching a lot with them, performing a lot with them, and just really starting to see the power of art to bring visibility to a group of people that otherwise would be invisible. But beyond that, also bring to light
Mm.
the fact that this group of people, we don't have to be siphoned off in the corner. We can, if we're all working together, something
Mm-hmm.
really amazing and unique can come out of it. I mean, like I would have people balancing on my shoulders. We would like, you know, be flipping each other around, like just stuff you'd never seen on stage before. And um, so, yeah, that experience really brought a lot to me as the artist, to the who I am as an artist today. Uh, and now as
Mm-hmm.
a primarily musical artist, I no longer dance. Um, I still really enjoy making video art, and collaborating with other artists with disabilities to bring that same kind of visibility. It's not always dance. I often do collaborate with dancers. I just recently composed music for an integrated dance company based in Miami. So that's still very much part of my
Mm.
vein of work. But um, yeah, it was just like such a cool new perspective that I gained through this journey.
There's so many moments in that I would love to spend an hour just parsing apart exactly what that experience was like and other things like that. But I think something that you talked about through this whole, it seems like this art was a really big part of changing your perspective on it. And I think something that I have learned in recent years, frankly, mostly due to finding people on TikTok and following them, is how many misconceptions in the narrative we have around disability and what that looks like and what that means for people. And you touched on a couple of those when you were talking about what are some of the things that understood better so they didn't fall into this ableist narrative trap.
I think internalized ableism is this nuanced thing that us as a society don't really talk about. We talk about racism, not nearly
Mm-hmm.
enough, obviously. We talk about sexism. We sort of talk about classism, but ableism, not so much. And I think a lot of people don't really know what that
Mm-hmm.
really means. And it is
Mm-hmm.
kind of, you know, as a young person who became disabled, it's been a pretty jarring transition to have my peers be at the prime of their physical life, and for me to be experiencing things that most people experience when they're, you know, older and their body is kind of breaking down. Um, and so to have to bridge those two experiences has been a lot. So yeah, I would think that, you know,
Mm-hmm.
getting even the term internalized ableism or ableism in general more
Mm-hmm.
at the forefront of people's minds so that they can recognize, like, why am I smiling awkwardly at this person in a wheelchair? You know, a lot of people do that to me, and it's not, again, not out of a
Mm-hmm.
bad place, but it's just because they feel so damn uncomfortable. Like they feel awkward that I'm there, and
Mm-hmm.
they don't know if they should be like really nice and try to be helpful or not, you know, or, you know, just to ignore me like a
Yeah.
normal person would.
Yeah, I think, do you mind defining those terms for people? Because they are, I do this all the time where I like catch a term and totally forget to define it for somebody who may not
Yeah.
know. But ableism and internalized ableism, I think.
I'm going to quickly Google the definition of ableism.
I am going to keep in the fact that you Googled it, because if you hear a term that you don't know,
Google it.
Obviously, if you're driving, listening to a podcast, remember to do it later.
Yeah. It is the discrimination in favor of able-bodied people. So it is just like we are a youth-obsessed society, we're also an able-bodied obsessed society. Mm. So if a person has a chronic illness or a disability, whether that's invisible, like a cognitive or, physically invisible one, or a visible one, like you're in a wheelchair or use a cane, all of a sudden you're inferior to other people. And people will treat you as such. And when it's internalized, it's when people have a set of assumptions about you based on what they see, even before you've even spoken to them. So for example, I use a wheelchair, and when people see me, they immediately, because of all the notions they have about what disability means, and this is the internalized part, they've already assumed that I am incapable in X, Y, and Z ways. I might be less intelligent than them in X, Y, and Z ways. I probably am not independent. I probably have some caretaker somewhere. And so their behavior towards me will reflect that. If I'm with someone who is non-disabled, often they will only talk to them. They will only address them, even if it has something even if they're talking about me. If I'm just going about my day on the street, people will just stop and be like, can I help you? And you would never do that to someone if they were just walking down the street equally as you. But because I am moving around the world on wheels and you don't really quite understand that, you've already made assumptions that I need your help. So that's kind of a breakdown.
That's super helpful. And if this is something that you find yourself really interested in listening to this, there was an episode, we talked a lot more about other types of accessibility, like particularly technology accessibility, but there's an episode further back in your feed with Yishan Lai where we talked about accessibility. So that's I don't want to keep putting you in a position to explain disability. I just know it's such an important part of your story with some of these things, and such an incredible, it's such a cool story around the dance and how that leads into music. But how much overlap is there with sort of your dancing career with this company, and you starting to move into music producing more? And what did that process look like?
Well, I think being put back on stage for the first time since my injury made me realize that there is a really valuable place for a person who looks differently from other mainstream artists. I'm not white, I'm sitting down. My body, I look more or less the same as I used to, but I think you could tell that I live with paralysis. It made me realize that there is an important space for people to see, to take up space, whether it's on screen or on a stage or in a public space. And so as a musician, I decided that that's what I was going to do. For 2 years after my injury, I was too ashamed to even post a photo of my full body on social media. So I didn't. And one day I put I forgot what it was, some little video about, I forgot what it was, but I put it online. And it was about music somehow. And people from all over the world were like, oh, this really resonated with me. And it made me realize that even though it made me, I myself was super uncomfortable with it, I hadn't really come to terms with it. It was really valuable for other people to see a story, to see someone's journey that resonated with their own. And we see that across everyone. Everyone wants to see a version of themselves in the entertainment they consume. Representation is so important for everyone. So
I'm curious how you started moving into music. I know you talked a little bit right at the beginning about how you were using a different medium to create music than you had previously, because you weren't able to schlep all of your stuff across to these random venues and other things that you were doing. So I'm curious as to if you could speak a little bit more to kind of how you would describe that evolution of your style, where what sort of that music looked like when you very first started doing that, and what sort of like all the different pieces that went into that were.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely started, I was not a very good songwriter when I first started, I realized. As a classical musician, I was always given my music, and, I understood the concepts of music, but I'd never really had to generate something from scratch. And so that's where it started, writing kind of bad songs. And then also I didn't really know how to produce music. It's a whole art form in itself. And so listening back to my original, the first things that I put out, it's not very good, and that's okay. And yeah, throughout time, I've really come to embrace music production as a deep art form that you could do so much with. You can, create just such diverse sounds with a click of a button, which is incredible. And as a songwriter, I've begun to, just diversify. I've grown a lot as an artist, and as I've collaborated with more people, just started to put myself out there. And I just think over time, I just naturally, through the process of trial and error, have sharpened my skills a bit.
Kind of some of the different influences in your music now. And maybe it's some of the artists that you've collaborated with. Maybe it's some of the different pieces that you've worked on, both in writing and producing. But what is some of your, how would you describe what you do with music now? And feel free to go really granular into like
a Song Exploder episode.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I would say I would define my music now as a bit trip hoppy. It's definitely very rhythmic. I love a good beat. And I really like ASMR. Nice. So I really enjoy creating soundscapes. So out of just random, I might take the sound of paper tearing, or something like a tink of on a bottle, an empty bottle or something, and just weave that in. And I for me, the most interesting kind of music is music that you can listen to several times and hear a new detail about it. And so that's what I really strive to do in my compositions, is to kind of almost embed Easter eggs, so that as a listener, you're not, maybe the song format is, one that you traditionally hear. You hear a verse, you hear a chorus, you hear another verse, you hear a bridge, goes back to the chorus. But in that, you can find sort of a new experience every time. And lyrically, a lot of my music is based in personal experience. That's why I do it, because it's very cathartic and, just my main tool for self-expression. So, a recent song that I put out is called Rodeo Pantheon. It's about my journey through taking antidepressants. And it's kind of whimsical, and it's a bit bouncy, but also a bit dark, because those are sort of all the different parts of that experience.
Yeah. Whimsical and dark. That's how I'm going to start describing my mental health from now on.
Isn't that all of our mental health?
Follow doctor's orders. You feel so good. When your voices stop their nagging, you feel like you should. We're cruising
listeners, you just got to listen to some of the clips of those songs we were talking about. There are links to the full songs for each of those in the episode description. So if you're obsessed and completely hooked on this music, I have fantastic news for you. You can go listen to all of it. I'm curious about, I know you talked about you just came back from this tour in Europe. Like, what are some of the like really cool experiences and opportunities that you've talked about some of these collaborations as well? We can maybe talk about that too, because looking at your website and some of your music videos and listening to some of your music, you can see some of your overall interest in creating art in the pieces you create. I can see that in the photos to go along with your music and music videos and other things like that. So I'm curious about just sort of what are some of the cool things that wouldn't necessarily be obvious immediately about music that you get to experience.
I mean, I get life from jamming with other people. I think that is the coolest thing about the arts, is that you can just lose yourself in a creative rabbit hole and like and as children, you get to go wild in your imagination. And that's not so much the case when you're an adult, but as an artist, it is. And that's cool. So for example, with some of the video work, there's a dance video piece that I made called We Sleep No More. And it features all folks in power wheelchairs. I call it a power chair ballet. And then my friend who shot it, who was the videographer, we just got lost in the ways that we could tell this story visually. We treated the camera almost as like another dancer. Where would this dancer's gaze be? And those are the things behind the scenes that you don't get to see.
Paint me away. I don't wanna sleep no more. I'm awake. Paint me away. I don't wanna sleep no more. I'm awake. Colors of my dreams. I'm not what I seem. Crown me. Just crown me. Vanilla, black and blue. I tell you this is true. Paint me away. I don't wanna sleep no more. I'm awake. Paint me away. I don't wanna sleep no
Most recently, I think I mentioned I collaborated with a dance company in Miami.
Mhm.
So I got to go down there. I was also I was on stage with the dancers, singing. And so, yeah, to be embedded in this other art form that I no longer partake in physically myself, but to fit my music in like a jigsaw
Mhm.
piece with someone else's vision is a trip. It's
Yeah,
great.
that's really cool. So with some of those opportunities, like doing this collaborative piece where you're writing a piece for this dance group, and maybe you can talk a little bit. Beyond the fact that you were in Europe, I don't know anything about what that whole touring was with your music. What are some of the cool ways that you have those opportunities, and how do you find those people to collaborate with?
Well, when you're an independent artist, you have to hustle. It's not that glamorous. I will just say that. A lot of people, they'll see my social media and be like, "Oh, whoa!" And like, yeah, it's cool, but I had to work really hard to create those opportunities. So, for example, my tour in Europe, it was a very DIY tour. I am not represented by anyone. So I basically just cold called people. I hit up everyone that I knew and tried to get connections. And I just, we got really lucky. We found folks who were willing to host us, willing to let us play in their spaces. And, but that's kind of how you do it as an artist. You make it till you break it.
it sounds like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you have sort of this community of other artists. Is that primarily, is it like lots of interdisciplinary artists? Like you've got these videographers that you know and find, like how does that work? Like, are those just individual people that you have met through various random things, or are those, do you find like in particular spaces you're more likely to connect with other people?
It's more individual people. I'm still looking for a place in the United States where there's just a whole, like an enclave of artists. I think I live in too expensive of an area for that to happen. I would love for that to happen, to go down the street and hear, like in New Orleans, you hear music everywhere and so many artists around. But so yeah, the hunt for artists is always ongoing. Yeah. Unfortunately.
You have your favorite people, right? Like you.
Yeah. As I deepen my journey into this, I'm being connected. In fact, I just got an email. Someone on TikTok found me
nice.
And introduced me to their friend who was a choreographer. And that's how it goes. You sort of, social media is, for all its evils, has really opened up a lot of doors, especially in the space that I work in, that is quite niche. Not everyone, what I make is not for everyone, and that's cool.
There was a couple of things in there that I don't think are for all its evils. We don't need to unpack that, but we can if we want to.
I mean, I think we all know.
Yeah.
We all know.
So you've mentioned a couple of different things that you do, including writing, performing your own music, and creating and composing kind of this particular music for particular people. But what are some of you mentioned specifically the idea of being a music producer. What are some of the different ways that you create, and that potentially people who might be listening to this could potentially work with you? Like, what are some of the different things you do?
Right now, I am largely interested in creating original work, but that could mean collaborating with other folks. So for this dance company, I went off of their vision. They told me what kind of sounds they wanted. They told me what kind of lyrics they wanted. And that was great. It was original stuff that I created, but for it, in collaboration with another person's vision. So yeah, as a music producer, I generally am writing my own stuff, but I have a fantasy of working with, for example, a hip hop artist. I would love for someone to just rhyme over a riff that I made, or, say, I'm a decent singer, but for someone with like a really different kind of voice to come in, just so I'm open. That's kind of the short answer.
And I think I so appreciate you talking about these things and describing these things. But for people who are listening to this, and obviously we've got those couple of songs here in the description, but if they're like, wow, I really want to listen to more of this music, I really want to consume more of this stuff, because they're honestly obsessed with you, as they should be, as we all are. How can they very kindly and very sweetly stalk you on the internet?
Well, I'm on the gram. Also on TikTok. My music is on most streaming platforms. And my artist name is Onikho, Onikho. And yeah, I'm everywhere. So if you are interested in following me, you can find me.
And again, those will be in the description. Please don't crash your cars. I always listen to podcasts in the car, so I always picture like people in the car being like, I'm just gonna look this up on Spotify while I'm driving. There's a link in the description. Don't crash. Be careful, guys. But well, genuinely, like, thank you so much for coming here today and talking about this. It's been super incredible to get to chat with you about all of this stuff. We'll get some of those clips in here so people can listen to some of your music, and I'm sure they're all going to check the rest of that out. Like I said, some of your music videos and images that you have on your website there's so much visual things that are really cool about the art that you create, that as a musical artist, I don't always necessarily think of that, but I'd heard your music previously after following you on TikTok, but I hadn't necessarily like it wasn't until I had invited you on the podcast that I went and saw some of these other things. So very worth checking those out on her website and all of that stuff as well. But you can also find Care So Much across all of the different platforms, doing all of the different things. A couple of episodes that you may be interested if this one was particularly interesting to you. Like I mentioned, we have the Yishan Lai episode on accessibility. We also have an episode, a totally different kind of art, but by the time this episode comes out, a beadwork artist came on and we talked about sort of beadwork art and how all of that plays into all these different layers of culture and is in some ways very interdisciplinary, like this art that you talk about creating as well. So you can go find all of that. If you're out there and you're really passionate about something and you could talk about it for hours and days on end, but you think that nobody cares because you believe that you should be less passionate about it, just know that I care. I care so much.